she accidentally sent a love text to the cold CEO, and what he replied made her cry until morning. But before we begin tonight's story, let us know in the comments which city you are watching from tonight, and please stay until the very end, because what happens in the final minutes will stay with you for a long time. Enjoy the story, everyone. Mira Bennett was 26 years old, and she had not cried in front of another human being for almost 4 years, not because she did not want to, but because she had learned very early in life that tears were a luxury that working girls like her could not afford. She lived in a small one-bedroom apartment on the 5th floor of a tired brick building on the east side of the city, where the radiator coughed every winter and the elevator had been broken. Since the spring, her mother slept in the only bedroom, and Mira slept on a narrow folding couch in the living room, with a thin blanket and a stack of unpaid medical bills on the side table that she rearranged every Sunday night as if rearranging them could make them smaller. Her mother had been sick for almost 2 years now, a slow, cruel illness that ate away at her strength a little more each month, and the treatments cost more money than Mira had ever held in her hands at one time, which was why Mira worked 2 jobs and slept 4 hours a night and walked 12 blocks in the cold every morning because the bus fare was $3. And $3 was a meal for her mother. Her main job was as a junior executive assistant on the 42nd floor of Cross Tower, a glass and steel building so tall that on cloudy days the top of it disappeared into the sky, and inside that building, behind 2 sets of mahogany doors and a private elevator that only 3 people in the world had the code to, worked a man named Adrian Cross, the chief executive officer of Cross Holdings, and the coldest man Mira had ever met in her life. He was 34 years old. He was worth more money than entire small countries, and he had a face that the magazines called sculpted, but Mira privately thought of as carved out of ice. He never smiled, he never raised his voice. He did not need to, because when Adrian Cross walked into a room, every conversation stopped, and every back straightened, and even the air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for him to speak. Mira had worked there for 14 months, and in those 14 months, Adrian had spoken directly to her. Exactly 9 times. She remembered each one. She remembered the first time when she had brought him a coffee, and he had glanced at the cup and said, "No sugar," and walked away, and she remembered the 7th time when he had paused at her desk and said, "The report on page 12 is wrong, fix it before noon," and she remembered the 9th time, which had been only 3 days ago, when he had stopped behind her chair as she was rushing out the door at midnight, and he had said in a voice so quiet she almost did not hear it, "You look tired, Miss Bennett, go home." And that was the moment Mira realized something dangerous, something foolish, something that a girl in her position could never afford to feel. She realized that she was a little bit in love with him, not the way the magazines wrote about love, and not the way the women in his board meetings looked at him with their painted smiles and their expensive perfume, but in the quiet, hopeless way a person falls in love with the moon, knowing she will never touch it. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself it was exhaustion. She told herself it was the simple gratitude of a poor girl who had been noticed for a moment by a man who noticed almost no one. But on that particular Wednesday night, when the rain was falling sideways against her window and the city below looked like a smear of yellow lights through the wet glass, Mira sat on her folding couch with her cheap phone in her hand, and she did something she had never done before. She opened a new text message, and she began to write her mother had fallen asleep early after the new round of pills, and the apartment was silent except for the soft humming of the old refrigerator, and Mira felt that particular kind of loneliness that only arrives after midnight, the kind that whispers terrible truths into your ear, the kind that tells you that no one is coming to save you, and that the life you are living is the only life you will ever have. And Mira began to type because she did not know what else to do. She told herself she was only writing to her best friend Sarah, who lived 3 states away and who always answered her late-night texts. With a heart emoji and a soft word, she told herself it was harmless. She told herself she would never send it, but her thumbs kept moving and the words kept coming, and she wrote things she had never said out loud to anyone. She wrote, "I think I am in love with him, and I know how stupid that sounds because he does not even know my middle name." She wrote, "He walked past my desk today and asked if I was tired, and I almost cried. Right there, in front of the printer," she wrote, "I do not want anything from him. I just want him to be happy, because I think behind all that ice he is the loneliest person in that whole building, and I see it even when no one else does." She wrote, "I would give anything just to make him smile one time." She wrote, "Please do not laugh at me, Sarah. I just needed to say it to someone tonight." And then her thumb slipped because her hand was shaking. And the phone was old, and the screen was cracked, and the contact she had selected was not Sarah Bennett at the top of her favorites list. It was the contact directly below it, the contact she had saved 14 months ago, on her first day of work, with 2 simple letters, "Ac," and "the moment." She saw the message bubble turn from gray to blue, and the small word "delivered" appear underneath it. Mira understood what she had just done, and the phone fell from her hand and rolled across the worn carpet, and stopped against the leg of the coffee table, and she could not breathe. The silence that followed was not really silence, it was something thicker. It was the sound of a life cracking down the middle, and for a long, terrible moment Mira simply sat there, staring at the phone, as if she could undo the last 30 seconds by sheer force of will. She crawled forward, across the carpet on her knees, because her legs did not work anymore, and she picked up the phone with trembling fingers, and she opened the conversation. And there it was, glowing softly in the dark room, a long, unbroken paragraph of every secret thing she had ever felt, sent to a man who could fire her with one sentence, sent to a man who probably had not opened a personal text message in 5 years, sent to a man whose name was, at this very moment, sitting at the top of her message history like a verdict. She tried to delete it. She pressed every button she knew she tried to unsend. She searched through the settings. She opened forums on her browser at 2 in the morning, typing, "How do you unsend a text that has already been delivered?" And every single answer was the same: "You cannot. You cannot. You cannot." The message had crossed an invisible line, and there was no calling it back. She sat on the floor of her apartment in her old gray t-shirt and her thin pajama pants, and she pressed both hands against her mouth so she would not wake her mother, and she cried in a way she had not cried since her father had left them when she was 11 years old. Great, silent, shaking sobs that came from somewhere deep below her ribs. She thought about the rent. She thought about the medical bills. She thought about the small bottle of pills on her mother's nightstand that cost $240 and lasted only 30 days, and she thought about how in the morning when she walked into Cross Tower and rode that long elevator up to the 42nd floor, she would have to look the man she had just confessed her heart to in the eye and pretend she had not destroyed her own life. Around 4 in the morning the phone buzzed, and Mira's whole body jerked as if she had been electrocuted. She did not want to look. She could not bear to look, but her hand moved on its own, and she lifted the screen, and there it was, a single short response from the contact named Ac, and her vision blurred so badly she had to wipe her eyes 3 times before she could read it, and the message said only 2 words. It said, "Go to sleep," and Mira stared at those 2 words for a very long time because they were not the words she had expected. They were not the words of a man about to fire her. They were not the words of a man laughing at her. They were the words of someone who had read every single line and chosen to be kind, and that almost broke her more than cruelty would have, because Mira Bennett was a girl who knew how to survive cruelty, but she had no defense against kindness. She did not sleep, of course. She lay on her folding couch, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a small bird with 1 broken wing, and she counted the hours until sunrise, and at 6:30, when the gray light began to creep. Through her window she got up, and she stood under the cold shower for a long time, because the hot water had been shut off 2 weeks ago, and she put on the only blazer she owned, the navy one, with the loose button on, the cuff, and she walked the 12 blocks to Cross Tower in shoes that pinched her heels, and she rehearsed in her head every possible thing she could say if he asked her about the message. She rehearsed apologies and explanations and resignations. She rehearsed walking into his office and quitting before he could fire her, because she thought, maybe at least, that way she could keep some small piece of her dignity intact. When she stepped out of the elevator on the 42nd floor, the office was still mostly empty. The cleaning crew was finishing up, and the receptionist Helena was sorting the morning packages, and Helena looked up and smiled and said, "Good morning, Mira," and Mira could not even answer. She walked to her small desk in the open bay outside Adrian's private office, and she sat down and she put her purse in the bottom drawer, and she stared at the dark screen of her computer, and she waited. Adrian arrived at 7:43. He always arrived at 7:43, because he had been arriving at 7:43 for the last 6 years, and Mira knew, without looking up, because she had learned to recognize the particular weight of his footsteps on the marble floor. She did not raise her eyes. She could not raise her eyes. She heard him pause for a fraction of a second by her desk, and she felt the air change the way the air changes right before lightning. And then he kept walking, and the heavy door of his office closed softly behind him, and Mira finally took a real breath. For the first time in 9 hours, nothing happened for almost 2 hours. She answered emails, she scheduled meetings, she filed expense reports for the accounting team, and every time her computer pinged with a new message, her heart leapt into her throat, and every time it was nothing. It was the marketing team, it was an invoice, it was a calendar invite at 10:15. The intercom on her desk crackled to life, and Adrian's voice came through low and even and impossible to read, and he said, "Miss Bennett, please come into my office and bring the Hargrove file." Mira stood up too fast, and her knees almost buckled, and she pressed her palm flat against the desk to steady herself, and Helena from across the bay gave her a curious look, and Mira tried to smile and failed, and she gathered the Hargrove file from her cabinet, and she walked the longest 15 steps of her entire life toward the mahogany door of his office, and she lifted her hand to knock, and she could not feel her fingers, and she thought to herself, "This is the moment my whole life ends," and she pushed the door open. Adrian was standing by the window with his back to her, his hands clasped behind his back in that way he always stood when he was thinking. The morning light was pouring through the floor-to-ceiling glass, and it caught the edges of his dark gray suit and outlined him in a soft gold that did not match the man at all, and for a moment, Mira just stood in the doorway, clutching the Hargrove file against her chest like it was a shield, and she waited for him to turn around. He did not turn around right away. Instead, he said, in that quiet voice of his, "Close the door, Miss Bennett," and she closed the door, and the soft click of the latch sounded like a verdict. She walked forward and placed the file on the edge of his enormous polished desk, and she stepped back and folded her hands in front of her, the way her mother had taught her to fold her hands when she was a little girl going to church, and she waited. Adrian finally turned, and his face was as unreadable as ever, those steel gray eyes that the magazines wrote so much about, and the sharp, clean line of his jaw, and the slight shadow under his eyes that Mira suddenly noticed for the first time, as if he had not slept either. He looked at her for a long moment, and Mira could feel her heartbeat in her throat, and then he said, "Sit down, please," and the word "please" was so unexpected from him that Mira almost did not understand it. She lowered herself into one of the 2 leather chairs across from his desk, and she kept her eyes fixed on the small abstract painting on the wall behind him, because she could not bear to look directly at his. Face Adrian did not sit. He leaned against the front of his desk and crossed his arms loosely, and he was quiet for so long that Mira finally lifted her eyes and met his, and what she saw there was not anger, and it was not amusement, and it was not pity. It was something far more frightening. It was curiosity. He said, "I read your message," and Mira opened her mouth and closed it again because nothing she had rehearsed in front of her, bathroom mirror at 4 in the morning, seemed appropriate anymore. He said, "I read it 3 times," and Mira felt the tears rising again, and she bit the inside of her cheek hard to keep them back, and she finally managed to whisper, "Sir, I am so sorry. It was not meant for you. It was meant for a friend. My phone slipped. I will resign immediately if that is what you want. I will clean out my desk before lunch, and you will never have to see me again." Adrian listened to all of this without moving, without interrupting, and when she finally ran out of breath, he said in that same quiet voice, "Did you mean it?" And Mira's entire world stopped. "Did I mean what she said?" And he tilted his head slightly the way a man tilts his head when he is studying something he does not quite understand, and he said, "Did you mean what you wrote about me, about my smile, about being the loneliest person in this building? Did you mean any of it? Or were you simply tired?" And Mira opened her mouth to lie, because lying was safer. Because lying would let her keep some scrap of pride to carry out of this office. But she looked at him, and she saw the smallest crack in his perfect composure, the smallest tightening of his mouth as he waited for her answer, and she realized that lying to this man right now would be a worse betrayal than the message had ever been, and so she did the bravest thing she had ever done in her life. She told the truth. She said, "Yes, sir, I meant every word. I have meant it for 14 months. I never expected anything from it. I never planned to tell you. I never planned to tell anyone. I was just tired last night, and I was lonely, and I made a mistake. But the feeling is not a mistake. The feeling is the only true thing I have written in a very long time, and I am sorry for putting it on your phone. I am not sorry for feeling it." The silence after she stopped speaking was so complete that Mira could hear the faint hum of the building's ventilation system and the distant rumble of traffic 42 floors below. Adrian uncrossed his arms slowly, and he walked around the desk, and he sat down in his own enormous leather chair, and he picked up his phone. And he turned it slightly toward her so that she could see the screen, and Mira saw with a small jolt that her own message was still open thereon, his lock screen still glowing, as if he had been reading it again that very morning. And he said, "Do you know how long it has been since someone said something kind to me, and actually meant it?" Mira shook her head because her throat had closed. And he said, "Neither do I. I cannot remember anymore. I cannot remember the last time someone in this building looked at me and saw a person instead of a position. And last night, I sat in this chair until almost 3 in the morning reading your message over and over, because I could not understand why a girl I have spoken to 9 times in 14 months had seen something in me that the people who eat dinner at my table every week have never seen." Mira felt the first tear slip down her cheek, and she did not wipe it away because she did not want him to know how much his words were affecting her. And Adrian leaned forward, and his voice dropped lower still, and he said, "I am not going to fire you, Miss Bennett. I am not going to laugh at you. I am not going to pretend last night did not happen. What I am going to do is ask you a question, and I want you to answer it honestly the way you just answered the first one." And Mira nodded because she could not speak, and Adrian looked at her with those steel gray eyes that suddenly were not steel at all, suddenly were something softer, something almost afraid, and he said, "Will you have dinner with me tonight? Not as my assistant, not as my employee, just as." Mira, and the second tear slid down her cheek, and she made a small sound that was half laugh and half sob because of all the things she had imagined hearing in this office that morning, that was the one sentence she had never dared to imagine, and she whispered yes, and Adrian Cross, who had not smiled in front of another human being in almost 4 years, smiled at her to understand why Mira Bennett sat across from Adrian Cross in that office and could not stop her hands from shaking. You would have to go back about 9 years to a small house at the end of a dead-end street, where a girl of 17 sat at the kitchen table doing her math homework while her mother washed dishes at the sink, and her father did not come home. Mira's father had been a kind man on his good days and a quiet man on his bad days, and a stranger on the days in between. He worked at the warehouse down by the river, and he came home smelling of motor oil and cold air, and he always brought Mira a small piece of butterscotch candy in his coat pocket, because butterscotch had been his own grandmother's favorite. And on the night of Mira's 17th birthday, he did not come home. He did not come home the next night either. He did not come home ever again. He left a note on the refrigerator that said only "I am sorry," and a small envelope on the kitchen counter with $200 in cash and the keys to the old pickup truck. Mira's mother had cried for 1 week, and then she had stopped crying, and she had taken a second job at the diner on the highway, and she had told Mira, "Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who teach you how to live without being loved." Mira had taken that lesson, and she had wrapped it around herself like a coat, and she had worn it for almost a decade. She had stopped expecting anyone to stay. She had stopped expecting anyone to choose her. She had finished high school, and she had taken night classes at the community college, and she had worked at a coffee shop and then a bookstore and then a small accounting firm, and she had saved every single dollar she could because she had promised herself one thing. She had promised herself that when her mother got sick, the way her mother's mother had gotten sick, she would not be helpless the way her mother had been helpless, and the sickness had come anyway. Of course, it had come 3 years after Mira moved her mother into the small 5th-floor apartment, a slow, tired softening of her mother's body that the doctors gave fancy Latin names and ugly 5-letter abbreviations, and a treatment plan that cost more than Mira earned in 3 months. Mira had applied for the assistant job at Cross Holdings on a whim. She had not believed they would call her back. She had not believed they would even read her resume, but a woman in human resources named Patricia had liked the careful way Mira had filled out the forms and had given her a chance, and the salary at Cross Holdings was almost double what she had been making at the accounting firm, and that extra money was the difference between her mother living and her mother giving up. And so Mira had taken the job, and she had moved into the orbit of Adrian Cross, and she had learned very quickly that the man at the top of the tower was not a man at all. To most of the people who worked for him, he was a function. He was a decision. He was a signature at the bottom of a contract. Mira had watched him for 14 months, and she had begun to notice things that other people did not notice. She had noticed that he always took his coffee black, not because he liked it black, but because he had once tasted cream that had gone bad on a long international flight, and he had never trusted dairy again. She had noticed that he always paused for exactly 2 seconds before opening the door to the boardroom, as if he was bracing himself. She had noticed that on the rare occasions he ate lunch at his desk, he ate the same simple thing every time, a turkey sandwich on rye with mustard and a green apple cut into quarters. And she had noticed that on the wall of his office behind his desk, there was one single framed photograph that was not of a stock chart or a yacht or a famous handshake. It was of an old wooden swing hanging from the branch of a tree in a garden somewhere green and quiet, and she had wondered for 14 months who had pushed that swing and who had sat on it, and why Adrian Cross had chosen that single picture out of all the pictures in the world to put on the wall of the most expensive office she had ever seen. What Mira did not know, what nobody at Cross Tower knew, was that the swing in that photograph belonged to a small estate in the south of France where Adrian had spent every summer of his childhood with his mother before she had died, and that the swing was the only thing in the world that Adrian Cross had ever truly loved. Without condition, Adrian's mother had been a soft-spoken French woman who had married his American father because she had believed in love, and she had died of a fast, cruel cancer when Adrian was 9 years old, and his father had buried her on a gray Tuesday in November, and 3 months later his father had remarried a woman from New York with a tight smile and very cold hands, and a son of her own. From a previous marriage in the warm house of Adrian's childhood had become a museum of polite silence, the new stepmother had not been cruel. To Adrian exactly, she had simply looked through him the way some people look through a window without seeing the glass, and Adrian had learned. At the age of 10, that affection was a weather pattern. It came, it went. You did not depend on it. He had been sent to boarding school at 12, and to a Swiss academy at 15, and to an Ivy League university at 18, and he had built himself a fortune by the time he was 27. And he had built himself a wall around that fortune that no one had ever managed to climb, until a tired girl in a navy blazer with a loose button on the cuff had sent him a message at 2 in the morning that began with the words, "I think I am in love with him." And now that same girl was sitting in his office crying very quietly, and Adrian Cross was discovering for the first time in his adult life that there was a particular kind of pain he had never prepared himself for the pain of, being seen. What neither of them said out loud in that office that morning was the simple fact that Adrian Cross had not always been the man he was now, the man the magazines wrote about, the man the boardrooms feared, the man who walked into rooms and made the air go still. He had once been 24 years old and reckless with hope. He had once believed that a man could build a life on something other than contracts and quarterly reports. He had once been engaged. Her name had been Catherine. She had been the daughter of one of his father's oldest business friends. She had been beautiful in the polished way that women in their world were trained to be beautiful, and she had told him she loved him on a balcony in Monaco when the sky was the color of wet stone, and he had believed her. He had given her a ring that had belonged to his mother, the only piece of his mother he had been allowed to keep after the estate was settled, a small, clean diamond on a thin platinum band that his mother had worn every single day of his childhood, and Catherine had laughed and put it on her finger and called it sweet. And Adrian, for the first time since his mother had died, had let himself imagine a future that contained another person inside. 3 weeks before the wedding, he had come home early from a trip to Singapore because the deal had closed faster than expected, and he had walked into the apartment he shared with Catherine in the penthouse on the 47th floor of a building 2 blocks from Central Park, and he had heard her voice in the bedroom, and another voice with it, a man's voice, and the man's voice had been laughing, and Catherine had been laughing too. And Adrian had stood very still in his own hallway with his suitcase in his hand, and he had listened to the woman he was going to marry tell another man that she did not love Adrian Cross. She had never loved Adrian Cross. She had only ever loved his name and his money and the apartment on the 47th floor, and the wedding was just a contract, just a clever piece of business, just a way to lock in a future that her own father had been losing for years at the card tables in Monte Carlo. Adrian had walked out of that apartment without saying a single word. He had taken nothing with him, not even the suitcase. He had left the suitcase in the hallway, and he had taken the elevator down to the street, and he had walked for almost 6 hours through the city in his suit and his polished shoes until the sun came up and his feet were bleeding inside his shoes. And he had decided 2 things on that long, silent walk. The first thing he had decided was that he would never again give any human being permission to hurt him. The second thing he had decided was that he would take his mother's ring off Catherine's finger before the sun went down again, and he had done both of those things. He had ended the engagement with one short, clean phone call from his lawyer. He had had the ring couriered back to his own apartment before noon. He had bought out Catherine's father's struggling company within 6 months and dismantled it piece by piece Not out of cruelty, he had told himself, but out of education. Some lessons had to be expensive to be remembered, and from that morning forward, Adrian Cross had become the man the world now knew, the cold one, the quiet one, the one who did not smile. He had built Cross Holdings into a global empire over the next 8 years, and he had not been on a single real date in any of those years he had attended charity galas with. Women whose names he could not remember. A week later he had taken meetings with women who had wanted his bed and his bank account, and he had been polite to them. And he had gone home alone. He had told himself that he did not want love anymore. He had told himself that love was a story other people told each other to make the long evenings bearable. He had told himself that he was perfectly content with the quiet of his empty penthouse and the soft hum of the city 40 floors below his bedroom window, and most nights he had even believed himself, but on certain nights when the weather was wrong, or the wind made a particular sound against the glass, or he passed a flower stall on the way home and smelled lilies, which had been his mother's favorite, he would feel a small, terrible ache somewhere under his ribs, and he would understand without admitting it even to himself that he was not content. He was simply numb, and numbness was not the same thing as peace. It was only the absence of the courage to feel anything else. And then on a Wednesday night in the middle of a season of rain, his phone had lit up at 12:47 in the morning with a notification from a number he did not recognize, and he had been about to dismiss it the way he dismissed every late night message that did not come from one of his 3 lawyers, but the first line had caught his eye, and once he had read the first line he had not been able to stop reading until he reached the end, and when he reached the end, he had read it again, and then again, and then he had sat in his enormous penthouse on the 47th floor of the building 2 blocks from Central Park, where he had once lived with a woman who had laughed about him in another room, and he had felt for the first time in almost 10 years a small dangerous warmth in his chest that he did not know what to do with. He had thought he no longer knew how to be seen. He had been wrong. A junior assistant in a navy blazer with a loose button on the cuff had seen him through the glass of his own wall, and now he was sitting across from her in his office at 10:30 in the morning and asking her to dinner, and Mira Bennett was nodding yes through her tears, and Adrian Cross was discovering that his hands were not quite steady either. He simply hit it better than she did, because he had been practicing for 10 years. The rest of that day passed for Mira in a kind of slow, soft blur. She walked back to her desk in the open bay, and she sat down, and she tried to remember how to do her job, and the words on her computer screen made no sense to her. She kept reading the same sentence in the same email over and over, and the meaning would not arrive. She answered a phone call from a vendor, and she could not remember her own job title for a full 3 seconds, and the vendor laughed politely and assumed she had a cold. Helena from the reception desk walked by twice and gave her a long, curious look, but did not say anything, because Helena had been at Cross Holdings for 11 years, and she had learned a long time ago that some questions were not safe to ask out loud at 4 in the afternoon. A small, white envelope appeared on Mira's desk while she had been in the supply closet, getting more printer paper, and inside the envelope was a single typed line on heavy cream-colored paper that said, "The car will be in the south garage at 7:30. Please bring a coat. The night will be cold." And there was no signature, and there did not need to be. Mira folded the paper twice and put it in the inside pocket of her blazer, and she sat at her desk for the next hour, and she could not feel the chair underneath her. At 6 o'clock she rode the elevator down 42 floors, and she walked the 12 blocks home in shoes that no longer pinched because she could not feel her feet, and she let herself into the small apartment quietly, and she found her mother sitting up in bed with the small lamp on, and the worn paperback novel that Mira had bought her at the second-hand bookstore for $2 open on her lap. Her mother looked up, and her tired blue eyes searched Mira's face for a long moment, and her mother said in a soft voice, "You have a different shape tonight." Mira sat down on the edge of the bed, and she took her mother's thin hand in her own, and she told her everything she told her about the text message at midnight and the 2 words at 4 in the morning, and the office at 10:15 and the dinner at 7:30, and she told her with a small, embarrassed laugh that she did not even own a dress. She had not worn a dress to a real dinner since the senior prom, and that one had been borrowed from a girl in her chemistry class, and her mother listened to all of it without interrupting, and when Mira was finished, her mother smiled, the small, tired smile she only gave on her best days, and she said, "Go to the back of my closet. There is a garment bag behind the winter coats. It has been waiting there for you for a long time." Mira walked into her mother's tiny closet, and she pushed aside the heavy old coats, and there at the back was a long, zippered garment bag she had never noticed before. She carried it out, and she laid it on the bed, and she unzipped it, and inside was a simple dark blue dress made of soft wool, with a single row of small, covered buttons down the front and a narrow belt at the waist. It was not new. It had not been new in many years, but it was beautifully made. And it smelled faintly of cedar and lavender, and Mira knew without being told that this dress had belonged to her mother once before everything had gotten hard. Her mother said, "I wore that the night your father took me to dinner at the only nice restaurant in town when he was trying to convince me to marry him. I kept it because I always thought one day you might need it, and I think tonight is the day." Mira pressed her face into her mother's shoulder, and she cried again, but it was a different kind of crying this time, a softer kind that did not hurt as much. Going down, and she got dressed slowly and carefully, and she brushed her hair until it shone, and she put on the only lipstick she owned, a soft rose color from the drugstore, and at 7:15 she kissed her mother on the forehead, and she walked back out into the cold city. And at exactly 7:30 a long black car was waiting at the curb outside her building, and the driver, who was a quiet older man with kind eyes, opened the door for her as if she were a person of importance, and she climbed inside, and the car pulled away from the cracked sidewalk and the broken streetlight and the building with the broken elevator, and it carried her toward a part of the city she had only ever seen from the outside. Adrian was waiting for her at a small restaurant on a quiet side street with no sign over the door, just a black lacquered door with a single brass number on it, the kind of place that did not need a sign because the people who were supposed to find it always did. He was wearing a dark gray suit without a tie, and his hair was slightly damp from the rain that had started again on the way over, and when Mira stepped out of the car and he saw her in her mother's blue dress, he stood very still for a long second, and then he walked toward her and he said quietly, "You look like a painting." And she had no idea how to respond to that, so she simply offered him her arm, and he took it, and he guided her inside. The restaurant had only 6 tables, and they were the only people there. The owner, an older Italian woman with silver hair pinned up in a tight bun, greeted Adrian by his first name and kissed him on both cheeks, and led them to a small corner table by a window that looked out over a tiny private courtyard with a single olive tree growing in a stone pot and the rain falling softly on its leaves. Adrian ordered for them both in fluent Italian, and the food came in small, slow courses, and the wine was the color of a sunset, and for the first hour they barely spoke about anything that mattered. They spoke about books and weather and the strange way the city looked from 42 floors up, and Mira slowly began to relax, slowly began to believe that this evening was real and not a dream she would wake up from in 5 minutes. And then, over the second glass of wine, Adrian set down his fork, and he looked at her across the small white tablecloth, and he said, "Tell me about your mother." And Mira looked up startled, and Adrian said, "Please." And so she did. She told him about her mother. She told him about the small house at the end of the dead-end street, and the butterscotch candy in her father's coat pocket, and the note on the refrigerator, and the $200 in the diner on the highway, and the late shifts, and the way her mother had taught her to fold her hands, and how to make a pound of ground beef stretch across 4 meals, and how to mend a winter coat with a sewing kit instead of buying a new one. She told him about the diagnosis, the long Latin words in the small bottle of pills on the nightstand, and the fluorescent waiting rooms and the bills she rearranged on Sunday nights, and the night classes and the bookstore job, and the way her mother had said, "Go to the back of my closet, there is a garment bag. Behind the winter coats, it has been waiting there for you for a long time." And Mira realized halfway through that she had never told this entire story to a single person in her life, not to Sora, not to anyone. She had carried it alone for almost a decade, and now she was setting it down, piece by piece, on a small white tablecloth in front of a man she barely knew, and somehow it did not feel like a burden, it felt like an offering. Adrian listened without interrupting. Once he did not even pick up his glass. He sat very still, with his hands folded on the table, and his eyes never left her face. And when she finally finished and reached for her own glass with a slightly trembling hand, he said in a quiet voice, "Your mother sounds like a remarkable woman. I would like to meet her one day, if she would allow it." Mira almost dropped her glass. She said, "Sir, you do not have to." And he interrupted her gently. And he said, "Adrian, please." Mira not. Sir Adrian. And Mira nodded and tried out his name in her own mouth for the first time, and it felt strange and warm and slightly forbidden. And he said again, "I would like to meet her, and not because I have to, but because I want to." And Mira looked at him across the table, and she understood with a small clean ache that he meant it. The rain outside had stopped, and the small olive tree in the courtyard was dripping softly, and a candle on their table had burned down to half its height. And Adrian leaned forward slightly, and he said, "Now it is my turn to tell you something." And Mira set her glass down, and she gave him her full attention. And Adrian Cross, who had not spoken his mother's name out loud to anyone other than his lawyer in almost 25 years, told her about a small estate in the south of France. He told her about a wooden swing in a green garden, and a soft-spoken French woman who had pushed that swing for him every afternoon of every summer of his childhood, and how that woman had died on a gray Tuesday in November when he was 9 years old, and how the world had become a colder place ever after. He told her about the new stepmother, and the polite silence, and the boarding school at 12, and the Swiss Academy at 15, and he told her about Catherine. He told her every part of Catherine, the balcony in Monaco, and the ring that had belonged to his mother, and the night he had come home early from Singapore, and the hallway, and the voices, and the 6-hour walk through the city with bleeding feet, and the 2 decisions he had made on that walk, and the 10 years of careful numbness that had followed. And Mira listened the way he had listened. She did not interrupt, and she did not reach for the easy words that people reach for when they want to make pain smaller. She simply listened. And when Adrian finally stopped speaking and looked down at his own hands, she reached across the small table, and she covered his hand with hers, and his hand was much larger than hers, and his skin was cool, and she felt the smallest tremor pass through him, and he did not pull his hand away. He turned it over slowly under hers, and laced their fingers together, and they sat like that for a long, quiet moment, with the candle burning between them and the olive tree dripping in the courtyard. And Mira said softly, "Thank you for telling me that." And Adrian said, "I have not told anyone that." And Mira said, "I know." And that was the moment something between them shifted permanently. It was not a kiss, it was not a confession, it was something quieter and stronger. It was the moment 2 very lonely people stopped being alone. The older Italian woman with the silver bun came to clear their plates, and she looked at their joined hands, and she smiled a private smile to herself, and she did not say a word. The car carried Mira home through the wet, shining streets just before midnight, and at the door of her building, Adrian stepped out of the car with her, and he walked her to the cracked entrance, and he stood in front of her on the broken step, and he tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear with a gentleness that did not match anything she had ever seen from him in the office, and he said, "May I see you again tomorrow?" And the day after that, and the day after that. And Mira laughed, a small, wet laugh, and she said, "Yes, Adrian, yes, you may." And he leaned forward, and he kissed her on the forehead, which somehow was more intimate than a kiss on the mouth would have been. And he said, "Go inside, it is cold." And she went inside, and she climbed the 5 flights of stairs, and she did not feel a single one of them. And the next morning, Mira woke up at 6 o'clock to a city she did not recognize anymore, not because the city had changed, but because she walked into Cross Tower with the same blazer and the same shoes and the same purse, but inside her chest there was something new. There was a small, steady warmth that had not been there before. There was a feeling that for the first time in a very long time, she was not walking up 42 floors alone. The days that followed unfolded like the soft, slow opening of a flower she did not even know was. Inside her there were small things at first, a single white tulip on her desk every Monday morning with no card, a private text message at lunchtime that said simply, "How is she today?" meaning Mira's mother, a hot meal delivered to the apartment 3 nights a week from a restaurant Mira could never have afforded, with a small handwritten note that said only so. "You do not have to cook tonight." Adrian and Mira protested gently. The first week she did not want to be a charity case. She did not want anyone in the office to whisper, but Adrian had answered her one evening on the phone in a quiet, patient voice. "This is not charity, Mira. This is what people who care about each other do. You have done it for your mother for years. Let someone do it for you." And Mira had cried silently into her pillow that night because no one had ever said anything like that to her in her entire life. 3 weeks after the dinner at the small restaurant, Adrian came to the 5th floor apartment for the first time. He climbed the 5 narrow flights of stairs in a simple dark sweater and a pair of black pants without a single complaint, and Mira had spent the entire afternoon trying to make the small living room look less small. She had washed the single window twice and rearranged the medical bills into a neat folder inside the side table drawer, and her mother had insisted on getting dressed and sitting in the small armchair by the window with a soft blanket across her knees and her hair brushed back from her face. Adrian arrived at exactly 6 o'clock with a small bouquet of white lilies and a paper bag from the bakery on the corner, and he stepped into the apartment, and he did not look around at the worn carpet or the folding couch or the radiator that coughed. He walked directly to the armchair by the window, and he knelt down on one knee so that his face was level with Mira's mother's face, and he took her thin hand very gently in his own, and he said, "Mrs. Bennet, my name is Adrian. I have wanted to meet you for some time. Thank you for allowing me into your home." And Mira's mother, who had not been able to hold back her tears for almost 2 years, lifted her free hand and pressed it against Adrian's cheek for the briefest moment, and she said, "You have kind eyes, young man. You should use them more often." And Adrian smiled, and Mira, standing in the doorway of the tiny kitchen with a dish towel in her hands, had to turn away because her chest was too full to look at them any longer. Adrian came back the next week, and the week after that, he learned how Mira's mother liked her tea. 2 sugars and a single slice of lemon. He learned which paperback novel she was reading, and he ordered her the next 3 books in the series in a single careful package. He sat with her in the small armchair by the window, and he listened to her stories about Mira's childhood. The time Mira had brought home a stray cat with one broken ear. The time Mira had won the 3rd grade spelling bee on the word courageous, which Mira's mother always said with a small private smile, because she said it had always been the truest word about her daughter. Adrian did not bring up money He did not bring up doctors he did not push, and Mira loved him for it. More than she could say, but on the fourth visit when Mira had stepped out, for 10 minutes to bring up the laundry from the basement, her mother turned to Adrian in the small armchair, and she said quietly, "Young man, I am dying, you know this." And Adrian nodded once, because lying to a woman like Mira's mother would have been an insult, and her mother said, "My daughter has carried this whole apartment on her shoulders. For 9 years she has carried me, she has carried the bills, she has carried the fear, she has carried it all alone, and I have prayed every night that someone would help her carry it before her shoulders broke. I do not ask you to love her. I do not ask you for anything I do not have the right to ask anyone for anything anymore. I only ask you this: whatever you decide about my daughter, please be kind to her when you decide it. She has been treated unkindly enough for one lifetime." And Adrian, who had not made a promise to another human being in almost 10 years, took her thin hand in his own again, and he said softly, "Mrs. Bennet, I love your daughter. I have loved her since the first time I asked her if she was tired, and she did not answer me because she was too proud to admit she was. I am not going anywhere, and when the time comes I will carry her, and I will carry you with her if you will let me." And Mira's mother closed her eyes for a long moment, and a single tear slid down her tired cheek, and she nodded once, and that was the only conversation they ever had on the subject, because they did not need a second one. Mira came back up the stairs with the basket of warm laundry, and she found them sitting quietly together in the late afternoon light, and her mother smiled at her the way she had smiled at her on the day Mira had brought home the cat with the broken ear. And Mira did not ask what they had spoken about. She only knew that something in the apartment felt steadier than it had the morning before. But of course, the world did not stop turning while Mira and Adrian were quietly learning how to love each other inside Cross Tower. People had begun to notice not the assistants on the lower floors, not the security guards in the lobby, but the men in the boardroom on the 43rd floor, the men who had been at Cross Holdings since before Adrian had inherited it from his father, the men in expensive suits with very small mouths. The chairman of the board was a tall, thin man named Vincent Wexler, who had been one of Adrian's father's closest associates and who had spent the last 6 years quietly resenting the fact that the company had been left in the hands of a 34-year-old who refused to play golf with him on Sundays. Vincent had 2 daughters of marriageable age, and he had been hinting for almost 3 years that a strategic alliance between the Wexler family and the Cross family would be in the best interest of all parties involved. Adrian had declined the hint politely each time, and Vincent had filed each refusal away in the small, careful ledger he kept in his head. And when Vincent's executive assistant, a sharp-eyed young woman who lived for office gossip, mentioned over coffee one morning that the chief executive had been seen leaving a small restaurant on a quiet side street, holding hands with a junior assistant from the 42nd floor, a junior assistant whose mother lived in subsidized housing on the east side. Vincent Wexler set down his coffee cup very carefully, and he smiled. The small, thin smile that meant nothing good for anyone. He began to make phone calls. He began to ask questions that were not really questions. He began to assemble a small, careful file on a young woman named Mira Bennet, the kind of file that men like Vincent Wexler had been assembling on inconvenient women for centuries. He did not move quickly. Men like Vincent never moved quickly. He moved patiently, and he moved precisely. And 3 weeks after Adrian first climbed the 5 flights of stairs to meet Mira's mother, Vincent Wexler quietly requested an emergency closed session of the board of directors of Cross Holdings to discuss what he called in the meeting invitation a matter of significant concern to the reputation and stability of the company. And Adrian Cross, sitting in his enormous office on the 42nd floor, read the invitation on his private email at 9:17 on a Tuesday morning, and he understood instantly what was about to happen, and for the first time in 10 years, his hand on the mouse went very still, because he understood that the small, warm thing he had been building in private for the last 3 weeks was about to be dragged into a cold, bright room and put on trial by men who had never known a single warm thing in their entire lives, and he understood that he was going to have to fight in a way he had never fought. Before the closed session of the board of directors was scheduled for the following Friday at 2 in the afternoon in the large conference room on the 43rd floor, Adrian did not tell Mira about it for 2 days. He wanted to handle it himself. He wanted to walk into that room and dismantle Vincent Wexler the way he had once dismantled Catherine's father's company piece by quiet piece, without ever needing to disturb the small, warm world that was forming between him and the woman he loved. But on Wednesday evening, as he and Mira sat on the worn folding couch in the 5th floor apartment with 2 paper cartons of soup from the corner, diner balanced on their knees, and the small television playing an old black and white movie with the sound turned almost all the way down, he looked at her face in the soft blue light of the screen, and he understood that he could not protect her by hiding things from her. She was not the kind of woman who needed to be protected from the truth. She was the kind of woman who had been carrying the truth on her shoulders for 9 years already, and what she needed was not a man who would hide things from her, but a man who would stand next to her while she carried them. So he set down his soup, and he turned to her, and he told her everything he told her about Vincent Wexler and the 2 daughters of marriageable age, and the small, careful file, and the emergency board meeting on Friday, and the kinds of questions the men in that room were preparing to ask about a junior assistant whose mother lived in subsidized housing on the east side. Mira listened in silence, and she did not cry. She had been raised by a woman who had taught her that crying was a luxury working girls could not afford, and she had remembered the lesson well. She set down her own soup, and she sat very still on the worn folding couch, and finally she said quietly, "Will I lose my job?" And Adrian said, "You will not lose your job, not while I am alive." And she said, "Will you lose yours?" And that was the question he had not expected, and he did not answer immediately. He reached for her hand, and he held it for a long, quiet moment, and then he said, "It is possible, Mira. It is not likely, but it is possible. Vincent has been waiting for a reason to move against me for 6 years, and he believes he has finally found one. I built this company from what my father left me, and I built it on the understanding that I would never marry beneath my class, and I would never embarrass the board, and I would never give them a story they could not control. I have just done all 3 things." And Mira looked down at their joined hands on the worn couch cushion between them, and she said, "I will resign tomorrow morning. I will walk into the office, and I will put my badge on Helena's desk, and I will be gone before lunch, and you will never see me again, and the board will have nothing to talk about on Friday, and your company will be safe, and your reputation will be safe, and you can keep the life you built." And Adrian turned to her so quickly that the carton of soup almost tipped off his knee, and he caught her face in both of his hands, and he said, "Look at me, Mira, look at me." She lifted her wet eyes to his, and he said, "If you walk out of this apartment tomorrow and put your badge on Helena's desk, I will follow you. Down the elevator, I will follow you. Out into the street, I will follow you. To the train station, and on to whatever train you take. And I will spend the rest of my life sitting next to you on that train. Because there is no life I built before you that is worth a single hour of the life I am building with you. Do you understand me? There is no version of this story where I keep the company and lose you. There is only a version where I keep you, and the company can decide for itself what it wants to do." And Mira pressed her forehead against his, and they sat like that for a long, quiet time, and outside the small window, the city kept doing what cities do at night, and inside the small apartment, 2 people who had spent most of their lives alone decided that they would not be alone anymore, not for any board, not for any chairman, not for any file. The next morning, Mira walked into Cross Tower with her shoulders straight and her chin lifted in a way that Helena from the reception desk noticed. Immediately, Helena watched her cross the open bay and sit down at her desk, and Helena thought to herself, that girl is about to do something the chairman will not survive. Helena had been wrong about many things in 11 years, but she had never been wrong about a posture like that. On Thursday afternoon, Adrian called Mira into his office, and he closed the heavy mahogany door, and he laid out for her in careful, precise detail exactly what was going to happen at the board meeting on Friday. He told her the names of the 8 men who would be in the room, and he told her which of them were loyal to him and which of them were loyal to Vincent, and which of them were loyal only to their own bank accounts. He told her the kinds of accusations Vincent would make, and the kinds of evidence he would present, and the way the rules of order in the meeting would unfold. And Mira listened the way a soldier listens before a battle, and at the end he said, "You do not have to be in the room. I can fight this without you." And Mira said, "No, I will be in the room." And Adrian said, "It will not be pleasant. They will say things about you and about your mother and about your apartment." And Mira said, "Let them say it. I have been small in front of cruel men before. I have not been small with a man who loved me standing next to me before. I want to see what that feels like." And Adrian looked at her for a long moment, and he understood that he was looking at the bravest person he had ever met in his life. That night he made one phone call. He did not make it from his office, and he did not make it from his penthouse. He made it from the small balcony of Mira's 5th floor apartment. After Mira and her mother had gone to sleep, he leaned on the cold iron railing, and he looked out over the cracked sidewalks and the broken streetlight and the dim yellow windows of the buildings across the way, and he called a man he had not called in almost 10 years, a quiet, older man named Theodore, who had been his mother's only brother, who had moved back to the south of France after Adrian's mother had died, and who had written Adrian a single short letter on the day Adrian had broken the engagement with Catherine, a letter that had said, "Only when you are ready to be brave again, call me." Adrian had not called for 10 years, but he called now, and the conversation lasted 40 minutes, and when Adrian came back inside the small apartment and slipped quietly into the narrow bed in the spare alcove that Mira's mother had insisted on making up for him on the nights he stayed over, he closed his eyes, and he slept the deepest sleep he had slept in a decade, because for the first time in his adult life he was not alone in the fight. Friday came in cold and bright, the kind of late autumn day where the sky is the color of polished glass and the wind has small teeth. Mira put on her mother's blue dress. Again, she did not have anything else that felt strong enough for a room like the one she was about to walk into, and her mother had nodded once when she had seen her in it that morning and had said, "Go and be my brave girl one more time," and Mira had kissed her forehead and had ridden the long elevator up to the 43rd floor with Adrian's hand resting lightly at the small of her back. The conference room was enormous, a long, polished table of dark wood with 8 high-backed leather chairs and a wall of glass that looked out over the city. Vincent Wexler sat at the far end of the table in a charcoal suit and a deep red tie, and he watched Mira walk in with the small, thin smile he had been practicing for 3 weeks. The other 7 board members watched with carefully neutral faces, and Adrian guided Mira to a chair against the wall behind his own seat, and he sat down at the head of the table opposite Vincent, and he said in a quiet, even voice, "Good afternoon, gentlemen. I believe we have a matter to discuss." Vincent opened his portfolio, and he laid the file on the table, and he began to speak, and he was very good at what he did. Mira had to admit that he did not raise his voice. He did not insult her directly. He simply laid out fact after fact in the careful tone of a man who wanted everyone in the room to believe that he was being reasonable. He laid out her salary and her apartment address and her mother's medical history and the subsidized housing application from 9 years ago. He laid out photographs from the small restaurant on the quiet side street. He laid out the timeline of the relationship, and he asked the room, with apparent reluctance, whether the chief executive of Cross Holdings had compromised the company by entering into an inappropriate personal relationship with a subordinate from an unstable financial background. He asked whether the company's reputation could afford the appearance of impropriety. He asked whether the shareholders deserved to be informed. He asked whether perhaps a quiet transition of leadership might be in the long-term interest of the firm. Mira sat in her chair against the wall, and she did not move her face, and she did not lower her eyes. She had been raised by a woman who had taught her how to sit very still under cruelty. When Vincent finished, he closed his portfolio, and he leaned back in his chair, and he looked at Adrian with the same small, thin smile, and the room waited. Adrian sat for a long moment, with his hands folded on the polished table, and then he said, "Gentlemen, thank you for your concern for the reputation of this company. I would now like to address each of Mr. Wexler's points in order." He did not raise his voice either. He was very calm and very precise. He addressed every fact in the file one by one, not with anger, but with quiet correction. He confirmed Mira's salary, and he pointed out that it was within standard range for her position. He confirmed her address, and he asked the room whether the address of one's residence was now considered a measure of one's character, because if it was, he had several questions about a number of board members whose summer homes were in interesting jurisdictions for tax purposes. He confirmed his mother's medical history, Mira's mother, and he said gently that he hoped no man in this room would ever be judged by the bravery of the daughter who had cared for him in his final years, because he suspected several of them might come up short in such a comparison. He handled the photographs with a small, dry smile, and he reminded the board that the small restaurant on the quiet side street had been one of his father's favorite restaurants, and that he was reasonably certain his father would have approved of the company at his table that evening. Vincent's smile had begun to tighten by the time Adrian reached the last point, and then Adrian paused, and he opened a slim folder of his own that no one in the room had noticed him bring in, and he laid it on the table. And he said, "Now I would like to address one more matter that was not on Missy Wexler's agenda, but which I believe will be of interest to this board. I have here a series of bank transfers and consulting invoices dating back 4 years, showing that Mr. Wexler's private investment firm has been quietly receiving payments from 3 of our largest competitors in exchange for confidential information regarding our pricing strategy, our acquisition targets, and our internal personnel matters. I have copies for each of you." The room went very still. Vincent's face went the color of old paper. Adrian slid the folders down the table one by one, and the 7 other board members opened them and began to read, and the only sound in the room for almost a full minute was the soft turn of pages. Mira sat against the wall and watched Adrian's profile, and she understood that the phone call from the small balcony to the quiet Uncle Theodore had not been only an emotional one. Theodore had spent his career as a forensic accountant in Geneva, and he had been waiting for 10 years for his nephew to ask him for help when the room finally looked up from the folders. The chairman of the audit committee, a thin gray man named Lawrence, cleared his throat, and he said, "Vincent, these are serious allegations," and Vincent opened his mouth and closed it again, and Adrian said in the same quiet voice, "They are not allegations, Lawrence, they are documents." And Vincent looked at Adrian across the long polished table with an expression of pure cold hatred, and Adrian looked back at him, and Adrian said, "The next move is yours, Mr. Wexler. You may resign from this board within the hour, and we will handle the matter discreetly, or we will hand these documents to the appropriate authorities by Monday morning, and you will not enjoy the consequences either way. You will not be present for the rest of this conversation regarding Miss Bennet." Vincent stood up slowly. His hands were shaking. He did not look at Mira. He did not look at anyone. He gathered his portfolio, and he walked out of the conference room, and the heavy door closed behind him with a soft click, and the meeting continued without him for another 20 minutes, and at the end of it, the Board voted unanimously to issue a statement of confidence in the leadership of Adrian Cross and to formally acknowledge that the personal life of the chief executive was not within the purview of the board, provided no laws had been broken, and Adrian rose from his chair at the head of the table, and he turned, and he held out his hand to Mira against the wall, and she stood up, and she took his hand, and they walked out of the conference room together past 7 men who would never again make the mistake of underestimating either of them. What no one in that conference room knew, not even Adrian, was that Mira's mother had taken a sharp turn for the worse. During the meeting, the call from Amira, no longer Amira from the file but from a kind home health nurse named Rosalind, came through to Mira's phone at 3:47 in the afternoon while Mira and Adrian were still standing in the hallway outside the boardroom. Mira looked at the screen and her face went white, and she said softly, "Oh," and Adrian did not ask. He simply picked up her coat and his keys, and he guided her into the private elevator, and he pressed the button for the ground floor. And the long black car was already waiting at the curb, because Adrian had told the driver that morning to stay close all day. They did not speak in the car. Mira held Adrian's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white, and Adrian did not flinch, and he did not pull away. The car carried them through the cold, bright afternoon, and the city blurred past the windows. And finally the car pulled up outside the tired brick building with the broken elevator, and Adrian and Mira climbed the 5 narrow flights together. For the first time, he did not let her climb them alone. Rosalind was waiting at the door of the apartment with her hands folded in front of her, and her face was kind and serious, and she said quietly, "She is awake. She has been asking for you both." Mira walked into the small bedroom and Adrian followed her, and Mira's mother lay on the bed in her soft, worn nightgown, and her gray hair was spread across the pillow, and her eyes were tired but clear, and she smiled the small, private smile when she saw them both. She lifted her thin hand, and Mira sat down on the edge of the bed and took it, and Adrian knelt down on one knee on the other side of the bed the way he had knelt down the first time he had met her. And Mira's mother looked from her daughter's face to Adrian's face and back again, and she said, "Well, you both came back to me." And Mira said, "Of course we did." And her mother said, "The meeting," and Mira laughed a small wet laugh and said, "We won, Mama, we won." Her mother nodded slowly and said, "Of course you did." Then she looked at Adrian and she said, "Young man, you remembered what you promised me." And Adrian said, "Every word, Mrs. Bennet, every word." And her mother said, "Good." And then she said, "I would like to give my daughter away tonight. If you do not mind, it cannot wait. It will not wait for a white dress and a church and a cake. I am sorry for that, but it has to be tonight." Mira's breath caught, and she looked at Adrian, and Adrian's eyes were wet for the first time Mira had ever seen, and he said nothing would honor me more. Rosalind quietly stepped out of the room and made 2 phone calls, and within 40 minutes a small, soft-spoken man in a dark suit arrived at the apartment with a worn leather book under his arm. He had married Mira's parents 31 years ago in this same building. When it had been a younger building, he had baptized Mira when she was 3 months old. He was 81 years old now, and he still walked everywhere, because he said his knees only worked when they were moving. Mira put on her mother's blue dress one more time, and Adrian stood at the foot of her mother's bed in the small bedroom, and the soft-spoken man stood beside him, and Mira walked in from the doorway holding a single white lily from the vase on the kitchen counter, and her mother watched from the pillows with both her thin hands pressed together in front of her chest. And the small, soft-spoken man read the simple old words from his worn book, and he asked Adrian, "Do you take this woman?" And Adrian said, "I do." He asked Mira, "Do you take this man?" And Mira looked at her mother on the pillows, and she looked at Adrian standing in the small room he had once never imagined entering, and she said, "I do, with my whole life I do." And the small, soft-spoken man closed his worn book, and he said by the simple authority granted to me by a state that does not yet know about this, and a God who already does, I pronounce you husband and wife, you may kiss your bride. And Adrian leaned forward, and he kissed Mira, not on the forehead this time, but very softly on the mouth, and Mira's mother on the pillows let out a small breath that was almost a laugh, and she said, "There, now I have given her away." And Mira sat down on the edge of the bed, and she took her mother's hand again, and her mother said softly, "Mira, my brave girl, I am so tired." And Mira said, "I know, Mama, I know." And her mother said, "I am going to close my eyes for a little while." And Mira said, "Yes, Mama, close your eyes, I am here, and Adrian is here, we are not going anywhere." Her mother closed her eyes, and she did not open them again. She did not die in pain, she did not die afraid, she died in the small bedroom of the apartment she had lived in for almost 2 decades, with her daughter's hand in her right hand and her new son-in-law's hand in her left hand, and the soft sound of the radiator coughing once in the next room, and the city humming far below the window. And Mira put her head down on the edge of the bed, and she finally cried the way she had not cried since she was 11 years old, great soft shaking sobs that came from somewhere deeper than ribs, and Adrian did not let go of her mother's hand for almost 20 minutes after her mother was gone, and he did not let go of Mira either. He stayed kneeling on the floor, on one knee, with one hand holding the hand of the woman who had given him the only blessing he had ever received, and the other arm wrapped around the shoulders of the woman he had just promised the rest of his life to. And outside the small window, the early winter dark came down softly over the city, and the streetlights flickered on one by one, and somewhere very far below a child laughed about something in a doorway, and the world kept turning the way the world always does, even on the nights it should hold still. The funeral was small and quiet, exactly the way Mira's mother had asked for it to be, in a yellow envelope she had left in the top drawer of her nightstand, labeled in her careful handwriting, "For when the time comes, Mira Reed." The envelope 2 days after she lost her, and inside were 3 pages of instructions written in the same careful hand, a list of hymns, a list of people to call, a recipe for the chocolate cake her mother wanted served at the small gathering afterward, because she had written, and I quote, "No one should leave my funeral without something sweet in their mouth. I have had enough bitterness for all of us." Mira and Adrian buried her mother on a cold Wednesday in a small cemetery on a hill on the edge of the city, under a single bare maple tree, and Adrian held an umbrella over Mira's head, even though there was no rain falling, only a slow soft snow that melted before it touched the ground. A handful of people came, Helena from the reception desk, who arrived with a single white tulip and pressed it into Mira's hand without a word. The older Italian woman with the silver bun from the small restaurant on the quiet side street, who had closed her restaurant for the day. A few neighbors from the 5th floor, a kind older man named Theodore, who had flown in from the south of France the night before, and who Mira recognized immediately, because he had the same gentle, quiet eyes that Adrian sometimes had when he thought no one was looking. After the small ceremony, they all went back to the apartment, and Mira served the chocolate cake from her mother's recipe, and people told quiet stories, and Rosalind, the home health nurse, cried into a paper napkin, and Helena laughed at something Theodore said in his careful French accent, and the small worn apartment held all of them gently, and Mira understood that her mother had been right one more time about one more thing. It was important not to leave with bitterness in your mouth. That night, after everyone had gone home, Mira and Adrian sat on the worn folding couch in the small living room, and Adrian said softly, "We do not have to decide anything tonight. You can take all the time you want." And Mira leaned her head against his shoulder, and she said, "I know, but I would like to keep this apartment, Adrian. I do not want to sell it. I do not want to give it up. I would like to keep it the way it is for a while." And Adrian said, "Of course we will keep it whatever you want." And Mira said, "And I would like to keep my job." And Adrian laughed, a real soft laugh, for the First time in many days, and he said, "Mira, you are not a junior assistant anymore, you are my wife." And Mira lifted her head, and she said, "No, I am your wife after 5 o'clock. Until 5 o'clock I am still Miss Bennett at her desk on the 42nd floor I worked very hard for. That desk, Adrian and I am not going to leave it because of a piece of paper signed by an 81-year-old man in my mother's bedroom." And Adrian looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded slowly, and he said, "All right, Miss Bennett, until 5 o'clock, and Mrs. Cross after." And Mira smiled, the first real smile she had smiled in days, and she said yes. Exactly that, and so that is how it was for almost a year. Mira kept her small desk in the open bay outside Adrian's office, and she answered emails, and she filed expense reports, and she scheduled meetings. And at 5 o'clock every evening, she rode the long elevator down 42 floors with the rest of the staff, and she walked to the long black car parked at the curb, and she rode home, not always to the small apartment, although they kept it always, and not always to Adrian's enormous penthouse, although they used it sometimes too, but most often to a small, narrow, brownstone Adrian had bought quietly on a tree-lined street near the park. A house with 3 small bedrooms and a kitchen with a window that looked out over a tiny garden where Adrian planted lilies in the spring, because they had been his mother's favorite, and Mira planted tomatoes, because her mother had loved a fresh tomato more than almost anything in the world. Helena from the reception desk became Mira's closest friend at the office. Theodore from the south of France called every Sunday afternoon, and Adrian and Mira flew out to see him in the small white house with the green garden and the wooden swing. Once every season, Mira learned a little French, and Adrian learned how to make her mother's chocolate cake from the recipe in the yellow envelope, and he was not very good at it the first 3 times, but by the 4th try it was almost right. And on the first anniversary of the small wedding in the bedroom, Mira and Adrian climbed back up the 5 narrow flights of the 5th floor apartment, and they sat on the worn folding couch, and they ate 2 paper cartons of soup from the corner diner, and they watched another old black and white movie with the sound turned almost all the way down. And at one point Adrian set down his soup, and he reached into his pocket, and he pulled out a small worn velvet box, and he opened it, and inside, on a small cushion of faded blue silk, was a thin platinum band with a small clean diamond, and Mira recognized it the moment she saw it, because Adrian had told her about it once on the night of their first dinner at the small restaurant on the quiet side street. And Adrian said, "I never wanted to give this ring to anyone else after Catherine. I thought it was ruined. I thought it was contaminated. I thought it would always carry her in it. But I have been carrying it in my pocket for 10 months, and I have realized I was wrong about it. It was never ruined. It was only waiting for the right hand. It belonged to a woman who loved her son completely and unconditionally, and I think she would have loved you the same way I do. Mira, would you let me put it on your finger now that we have had a year to know each other properly?" And Mira held out her left hand, and she was crying again, but it was the soft, sweet kind of crying that did not hurt going down, and Adrian slipped the small, clean diamond onto her finger, and it fit as if it had always been waiting for her, and Mira said softly, "Your mother and my mother would have liked each other very much, I think." And Adrian said, "I think so too." And outside the small window, the city kept doing what cities do at night, and inside the small worn apartment, 2 people who had spent most of their lives alone sat together on a folding couch and held each other quietly, because they did not have to be alone anymore. There is one more thing to tell you before this story ends, and it happened almost 2 years after the cold, bright morning when Mira Bennett walked into Cross Tower, clutching the Hargrove file like a shield, and waited to lose her life. It happened on a soft Saturday afternoon in the late spring, and the small, narrow brownstone on the tree lined street near the park, Mira was sitting in the kitchen with the window open and the smell of the lilies and the tomatoes drifting in from the tiny garden, and she was holding a small white envelope from a doctor's office she had visited 3 days earlier, and her hands were shaking a little, but not the way they had shaken on the morning she had walked into Adrian's office. Her hands were shaking the way hands shake when they are about to share something wonderful. Adrian came in from the garden in an old soft sweater with dirt on the knees of his pants because he had been planting more lilies, and he saw her face, and he stopped in the doorway, and he said, "What is it, Mira?" And Mira held out the small white envelope, and she said, "Open it." And Adrian opened it, and he read the single short page inside, and he read it again, and then he looked up at her with the same look he had worn on the morning he had read her late-night text message 3 times in a row, a look of complete bewildered wonder. And Mira nodded, and Adrian crossed the kitchen in 2 long steps, and he picked her up off the chair, and he held her against him for a long time, and he said, "Are you sure?" And she said, "Yes, I am sure." And he said, "When?" And she said, "In the autumn." And he said, "Is it healthy?" And she said, "The doctor says it is perfect." And he set her down very carefully, as if she was made of something fragile, and he knelt down in front of her chair, and he laid one hand very gently on her stomach. And he said, "Hello in there. I am your father. I have been waiting for you my whole life. I did not know it was you I was waiting for, but it was always you." And Mira put her hand on top of his hand, and she looked down at the top of his bowed head, and she thought about the cold, bright morning she had stepped out of the elevator on the 42nd floor with a confession glowing on the lock screen of a man she had been certain would destroy her, and she thought about the long, quiet walk she had once been afraid she would have to take alone for the rest of her life, and she thought about her mother in the small bedroom with one hand in hers and one hand in his, and she smiled because she understood finally that sometimes the bravest thing a tired girl in a navy blazer with a loose button on the cuff can do is to tell the truth once, even by accident, even at 2 in the morning, even to the wrong contact in her favorites list, because sometimes the wrong contact is actually the right one, and the universe is only waiting for you to slip. And that night, Mira and Adrian sat together on the small couch in the small living room of the small narrow brownstone, and the lilies and the tomatoes breathed quietly through the open window, and the city hummed somewhere far away, and Mira thought of one short sentence her mother had said to her many years ago in the kitchen of the small house at the end of the dead-end street. Her mother had said one day, "Someone will read your heart by accident, and instead of laughing they will answer you, and that will be the beginning of everything." Mira had not understood what her mother meant at the time, but she understood it now. And if you are watching this tonight, and you are tired, and you are lonely, and you have been carrying everything alone for a very long time, please remember that you do not always know which contact in your favorites is the right one. And you do not always know who is reading your story from 42 floors up, and somewhere in this loud, beautiful world tonight there is a person who is one slipped thumb away from changing your whole life. So be brave when the moment comes, and tell the truth even when your hands are shaking, because sometimes the wrong message is the rightest thing you will ever send. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. Please tell us in the comments which city you watched it from tonight, and if Mira's story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, because next week we have another story for you about a quiet janitor in a hospital who saves the life of the woman who once threw him out of her wedding, and we promise you it will be worth every single minute. Good night from all of us, and remember, the people who are meant to find you will always find you, even when you are not looking, even when your phone slips, even when you think it is too late. It is never too late, not for the right ones.